valid point to consider, wouldn't you say? All right, we're going to look at the U.S.'s astronaut program. The Mercury program was the first manned mission for NASA. NASA was established in 1958, 1st of October. And in 1958, they established goals. They wanted to, of course, at the time they wanted to be the first nation to put a human into space and orbit the planet. And after that, they wanted to spend more time in space, extend it a couple of hours, maybe a full day, couple of days, a week, and then start to explore the idea of putting a space station into orbit and seeing what it's like to inhabit space for maybe several weeks, maybe a couple of months at a time. And then in 1958, they had put a goal that they wanted to get to the moon, but that was thought to be something 50, 60 years into the future. Focusing on their first manned mission of Project Mercury, the Mercury program was the United States' first manned in space program. The objectives of the program, which made 6 manned flights from 61 to 63, were to orbit a manned spacecraft around Earth, to investigate man's ability to function in space. Remember, this is during the Cold War, so we couldn't really call up Sergei Korolev, the head engineer and designer of the Vostok rocket that carried Yuri Gagarin into space, 12th of April 1961. Because of the Cold War, weren't really pals and say, hey, Yuri, what was it like when you took off? Was it hard to breathe? What was it like being weightless? How was it controlling the vehicle for mission control? What was it like upon re-entry? How many G-forces did you pull upon entering? And what was the landing like? So these were things we needed to investigate on the U.S. side of things. And certainly number 3, everyone would agree, of highest priority to recover both man and spacecraft safely. Over here we have the NASA organization patch, the vector meatball. And then NASA does so many different projects, both manned, unmanned, planetary explorations, flybys, landings on planets of spacecraft. It's very important to distinguish the various programs, and a tradition came along of using patches to demonstrate representing the program that you're involved with. And this is the Mercury 7 program patch. The outline of the Mercury minus the 7 is the Roman Greek symbol used to represent Mercury. The 7 in there is to recognize the fact that the first crew or first conglomerate of astronauts for the U.S. program were consistent of 7 gentlemen. We'll introduce you very quickly to these 7 astronauts.
This is a press conference.
In case you didn't know.
April 9th, 1959, Washington, D.C. One of these 7 young men will be the first American into space. These are the astronauts. United States Project Mercury.
The rocket that was developed to take the Mercury astronaut to be the first into space for the U.S. is the rocket here on the far left and pictured in this arrow. That's the Redstone rocket, and you want to jot down Redstone. The Redstone was a proven capable rocket. It took many of the animals for the U.S. into space, including Ham. There was also another chimp known as Sam. And Enos was the first chimp for the U.S. to orbit the Earth. Abel and Baker briefed the Mercury astronauts in this cartoon from a New York newspaper because, remember, they couldn't ask Gagarin. This was the go-to for data of what it was like for a physiological system to experience spaceflight. This is Sam, as I referenced here earlier. The capsule, not too different than what the Mercury gentleman would use. The animals were going suborbital, so not necessarily achieving going to the Kármán line and orbiting the Earth, so the rocket could be smaller. They weren't going as high in altitude. If you have the little Joe, you gotta have the big Joe. The launches for all crewed spacecraft, crewed as in C-R-E-W-E-D, not C-R-U-D-E, but manned spacecraft. All manned launches take place for the United States from the state of Florida. The facility is the KSC, the Kennedy Space Center. If you look at the state outline of Florida, Cape Canaveral launch pad site is just off the coast right there. There is a visitor complex that has great museum pieces for you to explore, interactive displays, and Kennedy Space Center is also a working government facility as it houses the launch site for our space program of manned missions. If you were to zoom in even closer on what is called the Space Coast, this area of Florida, Titusville, very prominent area for people to gather and watch flights take off. Our very own assistant principal, Crosby, he spent quite a bit of time in Florida in his youth, and he even attended astronaut high school. I'm totally jealous that he can say he attended astronaut high school. How cool is that? The astronaut high school War Eagles. But we're all in the right place. Ridgeline High School, Riverhawks, that's the place to be. This was the Mission Control Center for the Mercury launches. And looking at the Alpha Mix Appendix, the MCC, Mission Control Center. This is now a mock-up in a museum of how the Mercury Mission Control would have looked for the first Mercury flight. And these things right here, those are telephones. And these are wires. You'd have to connect your headset to the base. And when we lost the wires and technologically got rid of them, that's where the term wireless comes from, because there used to be wires. So all manned missions from the United States will launch from Cape Canaveral in Florida. As soon as the rocket clears the tower, the control of the mission is shifted to the Johnson Space Center, the JSC, and the Johnson Space Center is located in Texas. The Johnson Space Center is named after former Vice President, then President Johnson. The Mission Control Center itself was fairly recently renamed, or actually it's been Mission Control Center and then named in honor of Chris Kraft, the first flight director for the Mission Control Center in Texas. This is a more recent, more modern look at the control center in Texas. So back to the perspective of 1961 for the first flight of a Redstone rocket carrying a human. The term CAPCOM is an abbreviation of capsule communicator. So once the craft itself clears the launch tower in Florida, then transfer of control, communications of the mission, it's all directed through Houston in Texas at the Johnson Space Center. As you listen to go, no-go sequences for launch, these are some of the different stations within Mission Control that will report to the flight director. The capsule itself, one of these 7 astronauts will be the first to inhabit for their mission, is right here on the page. Give you a sense of scale. This is on display in the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Again, give you a sense of scale since you're generally familiar with my height. Then outside in their rocket garden, they have one that you can actually climb into. It's tight quarters with that, and the control panel isn't even in there. There's an image of what the control panel would look like for the instruments, for the astronauts. Notice the very sophisticated GPS system, similar to Gagarin's. The quarters in the capsule were so tight that they wanted to make sure that the astronauts could, in fact, reach all the different controls. So this is in the early development days of the capsule to make sure that the astronaut could reach up and touch the controls since they were attached to the chair attached to the capsule. You'd hate to design this vehicle, put an astronaut in there, and they just can't reach up and control the vehicle. So lots of planning into designing a rocket ship and a capsule on top of that. Here is a great look at what it really is. It's a ballistic capsule. It's a person sitting on top of a controlled bomb, is how many astronauts describe the experience, particularly sitting on launch pad. With the Mercury capsule, the astronaut actually became, in a sense, one with the capsule itself, in that they integrated the system for cooling the astronaut into the suit, the chair mechanism here. Because it was such tight quarters, each of the astronauts had a seat molded specifically for their fit into the capsule. Here are a couple of the Mercury astronauts showing a Congress member a look at where the monies are being spent, essentially, and showing them the design going into the first rocket to take a U.S. astronaut into space. The Mercury 7, as they are dubbed, they were all test pilots, just like Yuri Gagarin was a test pilot. They were all test pilots, had combat training, very aware of the risk involved in becoming an astronaut. Transition from test pilot to beginnings of astronauts. They spent enormous time together in their training. Survival training has always been a part of the astronaut program. One of the things that they do is to practice with the supplies that they might have upon landing, like parts of their parachute to help slow their vehicle's descent, and maybe they didn't land in the ocean as was targeted. Maybe they would hit land and would need to be in a survival mode until rescue crews could come and get them. So there was lots of intense survival training going on, and here's where some of the gentlemen have fashioned some headdresses for themselves out of the parachute material. And as I said, the astronauts and cosmonauts alike are always involved in constant survival training. One of the folks that didn't become a Mercury 7 that many people of the general public thought at the time would be, as you might recall, the aviation great General Chuck Yeager, who was the first human to break the sound barrier, meaning flying faster than the speed of sound, and in the cockpit happens to be Jackie Cochran, the first woman to fly faster than the speed of sound. The general remarks from Yeager himself are that he was aware that the Mercury astronauts weren't necessarily going to be in full control of their capsules. He's a pilot. He wants very much to be in control of his vehicle from beginning to end of a mission, and he very much didn't want to be what he quipped spam in a can, which I thought was quite funny when watching the animated movie of Space Chimps. This played out. We're spam in a can. And we weren't even supposed to open the can. Probably a direct shout out for Chuck Yeager in the Space Chimp film. Not sure if he'd watched it. This is a great picture. I wish it was in my possession, as it's the Mercury 7 with their autographs. I do collect astronaut autographs. Have amassed a few here. Some extra special ones of recent acquisition. And as you're well aware, being in the classroom, that not only do I collect the autographs, but I also collect space patches. And we're starting right up here. And look at all these wonderful missions we're going to have the ability to explore. Now, don't panic. We're on limited time together in this marking period. We're not going to cover every single one, but we're right here. Look at all this exciting events in space exploration to come our way.